So a lot of people, think the serve's really complicated, which it isn't, it isn't. There's some pieces of it that are, but the general concepts are actually pretty straightforward. We talked about it in movement. If we go back to the basics, remember, there's only a couple things we need to realize. It's where do we have to load and where do we have to release energy. Loading, storing energy is one piece of the puzzle, and then releasing it's the other. So all we want to focus on is what matters about the serve. And it's all about energy transfer from the ground to our target. Our target's the ball and the direction that we want the ball to go, and then where do we store the energy. So think back to basic high school physics. For every action, we have an equal and opposite reaction. That's all it is. Storing energy in the reverse direction to where we want it to go. So we got to make sure that when we're looking at our servers, are they actually doing that? And then making sure that when we analyze the serve, we do it from the right components. Too often our eyes go to contact. That's human nature. So we look at contact and we try to make adjustments at contact. What the angle of the racket is on the strings, what we're doing up here, what's happening with our hand. All that stuff's relevant, but it's secondary to making sure we've got to contact effectively. If you're focused on contact, you're usually focusing on the wrong area. So we have to go to the areas that matter. And I was fortunate, we spent a long period of time looking at this stuff. We had a good team that was helping with all this. But like everyone else, we want to improve our players' serves. It's such an important part of the game. And for a number of reasons, there are people that serve great and there are people that serve average or below average. So what is the reasons that that is the case? Is it genetics? Is it training? Is it environment? Is it technique? Is it strength? And which are the most important? Because you have some players that don't have what you would say have great strength in traditional sense, but still hit a phenomenal serve. And then you have players that are really strong, really stable, don't serve that well. So it's not a pure strength issue. It's more to it than that. There's a flexibility component, no doubt. When we analyze the players from a flexibility standpoint, there's a few areas that are correlated with having a really good serve. Doesn't mean if you're flexible in that area, you're automatically going to have a good serve. But the ones that do have a good serve all have certain commonalities with certain flexibility components. There's also a component related to how do they utilize certain parts of their body. And we'll talk through all of those and try to focus on the things that really matter. So the style stuff, that's up to you. How you like certain stylistic aspects of the serve. You can coach it, teach it however you want. Just want to make sure that you focus on the things that really matter when we're making new adjustments. That's why some of the best servers in the world look differently to the untrained eye. If you watch a server, some servers from this generation, previous generations, and you look at them serve, you say, well, they don't look anything alike. But then when you break their serves down, they're actually identical in certain components. So we published a couple papers on this 6 years ago now, 5, 6 years ago, and it was all about what was the evidence available in the scientific literature on the serve. It wasn't opinion, it was just facts. It was just the best researchers in the world do research on the serve from a biomechanical standpoint, and we looked at everything that was ever done and that was published. So it wasn't coaches typically, it was biomechanists, physics professors, engineers, that type of person. Many of them don't know that much about tennis. They just know how to measure stuff really accurately. So we summarized all that and sort of came out with that concept, and we stole a lot of this from baseball, and there was these commonalities or these stages of the serve that every athlete goes through, and then can we understand it and recognize it, and then put in progressions and appropriate next steps to help athletes train and help coaches train so that they make sure they get in those positions correctly. So a lot of this came from the baseball literature in the US because that's where all the research was done. And it's not saying that we're teaching it like a baseball throw. It's got very little to do with it. It's more the stages of the body that goes through for an overhead motion. So we'll talk through some of that. So this is something that Bruce Elliott's lab and Mako Reed, they've done a lot of great work on this area. But this is a really important statement. The body kinematics suggests that service faults cannot be attributed to a single source. Okay, so that's pretty simple statement, but the purpose behind it is there isn't one magic bullet. It's not just fix this one thing and all of a sudden the entire serve's corrected. You have to understand this concept of summation of forces. So summation of forces means from the ground up in the serve, you have this cascade effect. If something isn't done correctly at the beginning of the cascade, something else has to pick up the slack and can never make up for what was lost previously. You can do an okay job, players that serve pretty hard and use predominantly their arm to generate the pace, but they're never gonna sync correctly, they're never gonna load as effectively as possible, and they're always leaving something on the table because of that. So we wanna make sure you understand that the lower body is highly important in this situation. We gotta make sure that we get the lower body done right before we worry about the upper body. Too many players focus on the upper body too early in the motion, not understanding that the upper body is important, but it only can use what the lower body gives it. Remember, the ground is where everything comes from, and we've got to make sure we get as much of the energy as possible from the ground up and then utilize that effectively. So, like showing Sam, because she does some things that are pretty impressive from a standpoint of mechanics, but also durability. From a perspective of being able to hit certain serves over an extended period of time. There's a couple things also that when people see a good server, they sometimes don't look at the right things. So when we're looking at a couple things to focus on, and we'll go through this in detail, but a couple things is the involvement of the back leg and how well that pushes into the ground. It's the #1 correlation with serve speed from the literature. So you've got to make sure that your back leg, not how much it pushes, it's how quickly it explodes up. So how much power you get out of your back leg. That's the driving force. So that's really, really valuable. The second big thing to look at with the upper body is the angle of the racket, meaning the range of motion that she's able to get into right here. Notice how at that cocking position, the racket has such an extreme position. Most players can't get into that position. She has what's called thoracic mobility. Upper part of the spine has range that most athletes can't get to, which allows, some people think it looks like shoulder. It's not only shoulder, it's predominantly thoracic mobility that has the range to get into those positions. So you're able to increase your lever so that you can generate more spin predominantly in this situation, better kick serve. So there's a couple major components that control the motion from that perspective. How you get there is what we're going to talk about predominantly, and how we can work on different areas. But again, there's some genetic components here. There's some flexibility components that allow these positions to be got into. So we'll talk about what those are and sort of what you do to train some of that. But again, notice how where my eyes focused, pretty different than probably many of you. Many of you are looking at maybe overall leg drive, maybe looking at contact and where the position was. All of that stuff is not incorrect. It's all good stuff. It's just let's talk about where we can focus maybe that makes the biggest impact. And if you change one thing, it changes a lot. We do a course in the US, it's a whole day course on the serve, and it goes through 6 different modules on serving and progressions. A lot of it's in the gym, in the lab. We do a bunch of analysis on it. So what I'll do is I'll summarize some of that and talk through it. So a lot of it has to do with components that matter. Forget about the style, focus on the substance, and then what are optimum mechanics. So these 8 stages are sort of what helps us focus our analysis. So we're not, there was something done in the 80s that looked at 27 positions of the serve, which wasn't incorrect. It was all good stuff. It's just 27 positions of a serve is a lot of positions in a motion that takes about a second or so. So we don't want to break it down into that much detail. We want to make sure that we have things that matter. We stole most of this, borrowed is probably a better word, from the baseball literature. They had 6 stages in the throwing motion. which has been utilized in a lot of baseball research for decades now. And so this is very, very similar. And I'll go through one by one so we can break it down in detail. So if you want this presentation, I'll send it to you. I'll get your emails, or I'll send it through Simon, and you can have it. It's these are cut points to know if you're going to break it down using, a software program like a Dartfish or a CoachMe Plus or something like that. You can, use these same stages as your key positions. So that you get consistent with them and you can compare across your players and compare as you go ahead. So from a start standpoint, this is the style aspect of it. A lot of players start really differently. So however you want to start is fine. You only really change the start if there's something later in the motion that doesn't look right. There's tons of different start positions, and as long as they get into load correctly, we're happy. If they screw up their load, then you may want to go back and figure out, is there something wrong with the start that doesn't allow them to get right? Many coaches like teaching their players a certain start position. They may like to point their toe towards the net post, or they may like to have their heel on the baseline, or they may like to have their back leg back here. They may like to have their back leg here, close, wide. They may like to do a slight step up. There's all sorts of starting variations, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with any of them as long as you can get to load effectively. So think about how you work with an athlete, and again, we're talking about performance players here, so we're not assuming they're a complete beginner. They've got some ability and they've served somewhat. So again, you can see here with John, he's got a pretty wide staggered stance, partly because he's got really long legs. So that's a component of it. Other people will have more narrower stance from a start perspective. So again, it's all about who you're working with, what's natural for them, and then remember, our job is not to change something unless we're going to 100% make it better. Don't just change something to see how it goes. Make sure that you have a really clear picture of, if I'm going to change something, it's going to make this component better, and it's going to make this athlete better. So the release is where everything sort of starts. Can your athlete get a good release, a good ball toss? And looking at the ball toss is important because we looked at the top 100 serves about 6-7 years ago, and then we went back and looked at about 20 of the best servers of all time, coach's opinion, who had the best serve. And we were looking at what were they doing on their toss that was consistent? What was the common aspect of tossing? And there was some actually very consistent components. There was a little variability in some things, but the things that were consistent was the height of the release, meaning when did the ball come out of the hands. It was always between eye level and top of the head. So it was always in about that much of window the ball would come out of the hand, which makes sense because if the ball's too low, it's going to typically get out in front of you. If the ball's too high, it's going to usually go behind you. So, finding a nice, window there where the ball can come out of the hand is going to help have a consistent toss. So that's one aspect. Which is pretty important. The other, which wasn't 100%, but it was a pretty high percentage of all the good servers, was the arm position in space here. It was somewhere around, if we've got a clock here, this is 12 o'clock, where somewhere at between 1:30 and close to 3 was where most of the arm angle was, somewhere in this area. You can think about the net post, the right net post as a guide, but it's somewhere in that window. It wasn't typically straight on, which a lot of players do release it when straight on. They're usually not the better servers. They have some limitations in their service motion. Reason being is the only way you can get away with doing a straight on toss is if the ball toss is really high and then they do a double motion, meaning that their back hip rotates as the ball goes up. Most of the good servers release on a slight angle because it allows the hip to turn. It makes it all in one motion. Really important component because we're trying to set up the body to load in the right position. What makes it easy for the body to load correctly? Those are the two major things. Everything else is somewhat stylistic. Do they have a long take back? Do they have a abbreviated, a semi-abbreviated? You really have 3 broad take backs now. You have the full traditional take back. You have an abbreviated or semi-abbreviated take back, and then you have a full abbreviated take back. And again, it's all a style component. Some are easier for athletes to do based on a number of factors. But they all, whether it's full, semi-abbreviated, or abbreviated, get into the load nearly identically. They look the same when they get to load. So that tells us that that piece of the motion is not necessarily that important. It's important for us to understand, to potentially teach if they're doing it wrong, but how it allows the body to store and release energy, it's somewhat irrelevant. It can make certain aspects maybe a bit easier for certain athletes, but we got to make sure that if it's getting them into the load right, then we're good. If they're screwing up their load, which is usually where we see the biggest issues outside of the ball toss, then we have to make some adjustments. So if we have a look here, this is where sort of everything matters. And as you can see, we skipped this whole piece here. Why did we skip that piece? Because that's where a lot of people focus. A lot of people focus right here. Because if they can get to load, it doesn't matter what happened there. If they can't get to load, then you've got to go back and understand why. But getting to load is priority, because that's our storing of our energy in the lower body. So that by definition, this is the storing of energy in the lower body. And that's all it is. All we're trying to do is store as much energy as possible in the lower body that we can then use to release out. So a couple things to focus on from a visual standpoint. Your hips are pointing back and down, your shoulders are pointing back and down. So we're like that. Energy is going back and away rather than what we see with a lot of players. Their shoulders are straight and their hips are straight and they do a squat. So a lot of people throw the ball up and they squat because they've been told knee bend. So they do knee bend, but they go straight down. Problem with going straight down is, where do we go when we release energy? Straight up. It's not how we want to serve. We don't want our energy going here. We want our energy going out. So for our energy to go out, we have to go back, but we also have to what's called twist rotate a little bit. And the twist rotation happens at the hip, not at the back. We need the back hip to rotate. And we need to make sure that we do that motion. So it's just, if I'm serving this way, it's just a slight movement. If anyone plays golf here, it's the same concept. In golf, the ball, we want to go straight, but what do? We turn our back hip that way. So we want to understand that piece. We have a downward storing of energy, but we also have a twist, meaning a back storing of energy. That's in one motion. So again, good servers do this naturally. We're breaking it down in coach language, speaking among colleagues here in detail. For a good server, they may do all that without you having to teach them anything. They rock up to the club and they've got that already in the playbook. Many of them don't though. So we've got to understand and see it if they don't. Elbow position's an interesting one because a lot of people spend a lot of time worried about the elbow position, which they should if it's wrong. The thing is, don't try to fix the elbow, fix the hip position. Because if you have your hip position correct, it's really hard to have a low or a high elbow position. If your hips are wrong, the reason we have low elbow a lot is because they want to get the range, so they get it from the elbow, rather than twist rotating back and allowing the position there. Because ideally, we want pretty good symmetry. We have that 45-degree angle or so here. That line, 45-degree angle from the elbow here through the elbow here in a lot of servers is that trophy position scenario. So there is some really nice symmetry in a good service motion because the angles, like we talked about in movement, angles in match angles out, angles in on the serve match angles out on the serve. So we have to really understand that. If the angles are all off, then we're not as efficient. They still are going to make contact. We've got competitors, they're tennis players, they have pretty good hand-eye. They're still going to make some contact and they're still going to hit okay serves, but they're not optimizing what they have. They're getting their energy from the wrong spots. They may be limited in the types of serves they can hit. Why can't some players hit kick serve? It's a technical issue about where they've stored and released their energy nearly 100% of the time. So, it's not something that, every player should be able to hit a kick serve. There's no justification why some players do hit it well and some players don't. There's factors that contribute, but from a purely loading and releasing energy standpoint, we know what causes a good kick serve. So as long as we get our players in those positions, they will hit a decent kick serve. They may not have the best serve ever in the history of the game, but they should still be able to have a good kick serve if we get our angles right. So any questions up till this point?
Yeah, I'm not sure whether it's something that you're going to come onto in a minute, but in this picture with Roddick here, where you see his ball toss arm kind of bowing back almost behind him, some servers do that, some servers don't. Is that something that you would encourage to get more power? Is it something that just happens naturally?
Yeah, great question. So you brought up, we were going to cover it in a little bit, but it's good to cover it here. There's two components to that. It's related somewhat to one of the misconceptions. I don't know if it was taught here, but 20, 30 years ago, they would teach a lot of people to throw the front hip out over the baseline. That was a coaching cue. Throw your front hip out over the baseline. And that got a lot of people in problems with coaching the wrong thing. Because we want to get there. That's what that position shows. His front hip is out over the baseline. The problem is what happened was everyone would shift their weight on the front leg and nothing was on the back leg. So they weren't generating anything from the back leg and they were just doing this. They were just literally shifting the hip out there. And as a result, it limits your ability to push off the back leg. You can't really use the back leg. You can't generate. And it also increases risk of thigh-related injuries. So you've got a lot of scenarios here with front leg problems. You see more so on the WTA Tour than the ATP Tour regarding that. And their mechanics for a large percentage of the players are different. So that's something that you don't want to misinterpret, because the position that you see is correct. His front hip is there, but how does he get there? By pushing back and down on the back hip, which pushes his front hip up and out. So that's one piece of it. The second piece specifically is this angle here. It's called lateral flexion. So getting range through here, what does that do? Pushes more body weight back, which is what we're trying to do. We're trying to store energy. We're trying to get as much energy back as possible. How this came about, is an interesting story. So, I played doubles with Andy at the Junior US Open, and he didn't have his serve when I played with him. He got it about 9 months later, unfortunately. But one of the things was how they actually got to this point. They got pissed off during practice one day, and his coach at the time gave him a really, he just said, hey, point your hand at the court sign. You know how you got numbers behind the courts? It was like court number 2. He said, point your hand at the number 2. That's how he got into that position. Because he couldn't get him to get back. Couldn't figure out a cue to get him to get back. And that was how that came about. So it was an interesting story, but it really allowed him to get in a position that stored, and he stored energy probably better than anyone when you're talking about loading and being able to generate pace from that position. And if you actually look back in history at all the best servers, pretty much none of them had shoulder problems. It's a really interesting scenario. The ones that hit the most aces, the ones that served the longest, served the biggest, they really didn't have shoulder problems. It's all the people that usually didn't have great serves, great technical serves, a lot of the ones that dealt with a lot of the shoulder issues. So it's something interesting to think about. So again, really similar position here with a slightly different motion. Then we get into this cocking stage, which is the next piece. We've started to shift energy. Our lower body's done its job. It's done. You can literally cut off the leg right now. The leg contributes 0 to the motion at this point. It's pretty much released all its energy. The energy predominantly is now sitting right here in the core and the upper body. And we've reached the end stage of our storing of energy in the upper body. So the definition of it is the tip of the racket points down to the ground, or it's called max external rotation of your shoulder. So it's the end point of the cocking stage. So again, same thing in a throwing motion. This is the exact same position. This was the terminology used in baseball as well. So again, at this point, the work is really done with storing of energy. We've already released our lower body energy. It's sitting up in the top half of our body right now. And from here, we release it out into the arm. So a couple things from this standpoint. You want to make sure that the athlete's still pretty side on. Notice the left arm here. It's tucked into the side. Notice how the shoulder's side on if I'm serving that way. that's a really important position for the athlete to stay in, because that means energy transfer is still going up and slightly in that direction. If they open up too early, which a lot of players do, they're starting to face the net at this point. So their chest is parallel to the net. That means that they've opened up early. That really produces two major issues. One is it's nearly impossible to hit a kick serve from here. So a lot of players that can only hit a slice from that standpoint. And two, usually to catch up with the ball and make good contact, what happens? They end up collapsing to make contact with the ball. So if you've got players that collapse a contact or land on or behind the baseline, most of the reason is they've opened up too early in the motion. So something to think about from that perspective. So really, really important to know that loading and cocking are where we're storing our energy. One is in the lower body, the next is in the upper body. Then we get through into, as you see here, same type of position. We've got this shoulder over shoulder position, very similar. This is from the front angle here. So making sure that we see the scenarios there from that perspective. Now we get into acceleration. Couple things here. The body's moving so quick at this point, there's not a lot of coaching we can do. We got to hope now that everything we've coached up to this point is worked, and now it's a release of energy. It moves really fast. So you're not making a lot of adjustments or any real adjustments at this point. You just got to see, is my athlete in the right position at loading and cocking so this works correctly? And a couple things to think about. Notice the left arm. Andy was known for flinging out his left arm at the end of his motion. And a lot of people misinterpreted that. And there were some coaches early on that was teaching that. Make contact, and as you're making contact, swing your arm out. So you would see a lot of these junior players over-rotating really early in the motion. And that caused a lot of problems, because at that point, early 2000s, there wasn't a lot of video work being done. It wasn't like it is now where it's really easy to do video work. So there was a lot of misinterpreting the motion, because he was doing some things a little bit differently to most servers beforehand. But look, elbow in close, great positioning here at contact. Shoulder over shoulder, so back shoulder over shoulder, front shoulder. Some people call cartwheel position. Whatever you want to call it, it's this position. Your body is parallel to the net, or your shoulders are parallel to the net. You want to stay side on as long as possible. And a lot of times players don't get in this position. So tonight when you go back and look at some video of your players, or this afternoon, see if you can see this position, especially from the front. Not enough people video from the front. Side and back is relatively common. Getting it from the front is really useful to see some of these positions as well. So you can see here, John's in a similar position. All the same type of mechanics that they're trying to work through is consistent. They're trying to get in those right positions. And again, how much is this coached? How much is this natural? It doesn't really matter to us. We know they do it well. We want to copy that, and we want to be able to teach that effectively. Okay, now contact. Contact position. Elbow is still tucked into the side. Still hasn't opened up yet. So you've got to realize that with your players, you've got to make sure that we stay in this side-on position as long as possible. There's a couple things from an angle standpoint. This angle here at contact is only about 120 to 125 degrees for most people, which is right around there. It's not up here. So the way we get there is we get this lateral flexion. So if my arm's out there, normally, how do I make contact like Andy's making? I do this lateral flexion. So that's why we have to have the range of motion through these muscles. The quadratus lumborum is a small muscle here that allows that type motion. That needs to be flexible. Our lats, back muscles, need range to be able to get into those positions. So you've got to do a lot of, it's pretty painful on an athlete to loosen that area up and stretch that area out. That's why typically manual work is required, or they have to really be able to push through some reasonably good pain tolerance to get a little extra range there. But it makes a big, big difference in them being able to get from here to here quickly and through a really good range of motion. Again, it's about how much pain does your athlete want to go through to get the result. Because all of us have stretched. If you stretch right, it's pretty painful, because you've got to push the boundaries a little bit, and you've got to increase the range. You've got to adapt. But again, we don't. There's a difference between pain and injury. We don't want injury ever. Pain's a good thing usually. We got to get a little pain in there. We got to get some improvement. We got to get some adaptation. Okay, contact position here. You can see, John's really similar there. That left elbow's starting to come out, but this angle's a little bit off. It's still very close in there. So, we want to see that from that standpoint. Above the ground, of course, they're jumping above the ground. See your players at this point, how high are they off the ground? They don't have to be supremely high. They have to be, inches, not feet off the ground. If they're jumping feet off the ground, they're probably doing something that isn't synced correctly. So you've got to be careful about how you're teaching the jump and what your cueing is, because jumping really high can sometimes zap you over the power. Why? Because what you've done is when you've stored your energy, you've either stored too low and you've lost energy to try to get that little bit extra height. It's a balancing act. We don't want full height. We want a full extension, which is different. Full height and full extension are two different things. We've got to make sure we're fully extended at contact, but we don't need our highest vertical jump height on the serve. We need a good amount of height, but we don't want to be fully exploding, because what that means is we've taken more time to store here. So you have to really find that balance. Most servers don't have that issue, but occasionally I've seen players that have coached jumping a lot and they've really emphasized the jumping, and the players misinterpret the instructions sometimes and overdo it. So their sinking's off and the coaches aren't sure. Hey, the player's jumping a lot, but they've got nothing on their serve. So if you've got players like that seem to jump really high, but they got nothing on their service motion, it's typically their timing of load to explode is wrong, and they've dissipated energy during the load. So take a look at that with some of your players. Then we get to decel, so they made contact. The ball's gone now. So there's nothing you can do at this point to bring the ball back. We can't put the toothpaste back in the tube at this point. So anything you're correcting, fixing at this point is a result. Anything we're monitoring at this point is a result. So what we're doing is we're monitoring to see, did everything work the way we wanted it to work? So a couple things to look at. Side of the strings. So I'm not sure if you guys can see it. The side of the strings pointing the side fence. So that's a standard long axis rotation. Coaches in the US sometimes overuse the word pronation. It's a little annoying because pronation is a component, but pronation is only that. Pronation is only a really small movement. So we've got to be careful about overusing the term pronation. It's really internal shoulder rotation first with pronation at the end. So the thumb down motion. It's really, really important for pace. That happens on the slice serve, on the flat serve, on the kick serve. It's, a lot of people think, well, that doesn't happen on the slice serve. We come around the ball. You realize there's only a few degrees difference. It varies, but it's somewhere between 4-7 degrees max on the serve at what your racket angle is for flat serve versus slice serve. So it's not a big difference in racket angle. It's not like one is carving around the outside of the ball and the other one's coming straight down. It's just a very slight difference at contact. So realize that aspect of it. And then this position here, if you're playing in warmish weather, if you can see the person's back, if they're wearing a regular shirt, that means you've got what's called, one of the coaches I used to work with termed it, it's called VUGE, vigorous upper garment elevation. So if you see the shirt right up the person's back, it means that the back hip is doing its job. It's exploding, it's loading, it's pushing up high and hard. So a really simple way to look from the back, did they get a lot out of their legs in the right direction in the right way? So something to think about from that standpoint when we're looking at it. So you got that same situation with the long axis rotation, thumb down position. Very common, very normal position to be in. So that's that deceleration piece. Remember, to stop your arm so quickly is not easy. The reason we don't have as many shoulder problems as, say, baseball pitching is with the sport that has the most, is because they have a very small implement and they release it very quick. There's nothing to slow it down. As we have the racket, which helps our arms slow down over a longer distance. So that's a good thing from that standpoint. That helps us decelerate effectively. So the finish. Remember, where is the ball at this point? Ball's nearly at the net, probably, with a good server. You know, the ball's pretty close to the net at this point. So if the person's landed, the foot's on the ground, the ball's gone, this has zero to do with the serve. Absolutely zero impact on the serve and how the ball and what's happening with the ball. Yet a lot of people, a coach, I want my athlete to land, kick their back leg up, look really pretty for the photos, and be in a good position. Which is nothing wrong with that, just understand what you're training. You're training the recovery for the first ground stroke, typically, if they're staying on the baseline. Because balance is really important, being stable is really important so you can come out and be ready for the next shot. But don't convince yourself that you're somehow training the serve, because the ball's gone. I mean, we can't train the serve by working on the landing. Some coaches will make an argument that, well, if they land right, it means they've probably got in the right position. Possibly, but wouldn't we just want to train the stuff that gets them in the right position, then kind of work backwards? So think about it. If you are training the landing, why? Is it to get them ready for the next ball, which is important, which is fine? Or are you thinking somehow getting them to finish in that stable position is somehow going to help them improve the serve? So just know why you're doing what you're doing. Again, having a good stable balance point is important for the next shot, but the ball's already gone. So be careful how you emphasize and why you're emphasizing the finish. So you know, nearly identical. Two different serving techniques. You know, one had a foot back, really abbreviated. One had a semi-abbreviated. I'd say John has a semi-abbreviated motion. You know, one person's 6'2"-ish, 6'3"-ish. One's nearly 7 feet. But you look at their landing and they look nearly the same. So again, things to think about from that standpoint. Microphone.
Just the implications of foot up versus foot back?
Good question. So foot up versus foot back. Again, getting to load is priority number one. So you can get to load with foot up and foot back. We have a pretty not even split. There's more foot ups in the top 100, men and women, than foot backs. But on the men's side, there's a few more foot backs. So it's not one's better or worse. It's what allows you to get into load more appropriately. So the challenge when some people bring their foot up is they shift their weight forward too early in the motion. So you have to be real careful if you've got a foot up option that they still get back and load the back leg. Whereas foot back, it's a little bit easier for some people to go straight back into the load. So if you look at Madison Keys, so we changed her serve when I'd say she was 16, 17. She was always foot up most of all her junior career. But she always had a problem with shifting weight early onto the front leg and tried to fix it for about a year with her motion. Made the adjustment to foot back, pretty natural for her, kept her weight back longer, and it really made a good difference pretty easily. Wasn't a major shift for her to do that. As other players, you do that, and it throws off their toss, it throws off their loading mechanics because they've done it for so long a certain way. So you want to sort of think about, if you're going to make an adjustment, understand exactly why. Why are you making the adjustment? Where are you trying to get the load? Where are you trying to get the release? So up until most of the taller servers would bring their foot up. So if you've got, not 100% of the time, Raonic is an example you can see now. Todd Martin was an example in previous generation. But nearly everyone else that was over about 6'5" on the men's side would bring their foot up. On the women's side, we see the majority of players bring their foot up. But again, there's not that many of them you would say serve really well. So that doesn't necessarily mean that it is a positive. You know, we have a few that do. Like Serena serves great; she brings her foot up. You know, so you've got to sort of look at it on a case-by-case basis, male or female, from a load standpoint, a flexibility standpoint, and are they loading in the right direction? So I'll skip over this real quick just for time. You know, how do you analyze? We have a little protocol we do with a lot of the coaches where we get them set up and they have, you know, your 6 standard serve locations, wide body, you know, T, wide body T on the 2 sides, and then you just get your visuals, you know, so we have pretty much, you know, 4 or 5 views. We have a front view as well that we'll do with a lot of the players, the side view, the back view, and then a 45-degree angle on the back. So if I'm serving here, my athlete's standing there, I'll have a camera angle right here. And that's more so to see twist rotation and to see, you know, X angle or angle of trunk and shoulder and hip turn to get a sense of are they actually getting that twist rotation appropriately. Again, don't do this every day, but just like we assess fitness testing, just like we do, you know, monthly monitoring to see have they improved, we'll do this probably once a month to make sure everything's looking right, make sure that, you know, the athletes are progressing and doing the adaptations that we're trying to train. So from this standpoint, common errors is a big one. We'll talk through some of these. We'll show some examples, men and women now, and age-based as well, of what we typically see. These are live. These aren't stage scenarios. These are in real matches, real training center scenarios, things like that. The start we talked about, there's nothing much there. Grips, don't really touch on it unless it's an obvious issue. You know, unless they've got a big Western forehand grip and they're fry panning it or something. But in general, unless you're teaching the beginner and you have to go through the basics, anywhere between an Eastern forehand and an Eastern backhand can work. I mean, you've got servers throughout history that can be successful with any of that variation. You know, a lot of players will change grips from first to second. You know, they'll get a little bit more Eastern backhand for a kick serve or a little bit more Eastern backhand for a slice serve. You know, it's a bit of a style thing. It's a bit of a leverage thing to try to get a little bit more angle. So don't spend that much time on grips unless they're extreme. And I think all of you know what extreme looks like. So don't let your players use extreme grips. But you know, some players are very adamant. I want every athlete serving, you know, in a, you know, continental only, and they'll force them in a continental, and it may not be that natural for them. So you've got to be a little careful with forcing an athlete into a position that you think's the best and feels good to you. They may have a slightly different mechanics that allow them to get in a position slightly different. So we want to make sure our technique is good, we're within appropriate parameters, but we have enough flexibility to let them do their motions. So ball in the hand, this comes up a lot, which always interests me, because, you know, as long as you can get the ball in the right spot, throw it up however you like. It's just what's easier. You know, that's the question you got to ask. Usually you don't want to bend the elbow. That just creates too much potential for error, flicking the ball. So you typically want to try to keep it straight. As long as the athlete can get the ball in the right spot over and over again and they're consistent, you know, don't change it. The problem is when it's not working, which is why most of the people change it, is, you know, you typically don't want the elbow bent because it allows too much flicking. You don't want the wrist to flick either because it allows too much variability. Where the ball is in the palm versus the fingers is a discussion that some people like to get into. But you've seen servers do both. You know, my preference, if you're going to force me to say what I prefer, it's more so having, you know, you have either the 3 fingers in the ball or these 3 fingers and so all 5. But I've seen servers do it plenty of different ways and get the ball in the right spot. Some people like the beer can release, you know, so they release this way, you know, so not a major issue either as long as it gets there. If it doesn't get there, then simplify it, just like with the motion. If they're doing it wrong, take out any area that could create a problem, especially when they get nervous. You know, so throwing it this way, you could end up flicking the wrist. So that's why that way I wouldn't necessarily recommend if there's an issue, because it adds potentially a little wrist movement. Here, there's less likely to have wrist movement. So again, something to consider. Serena, the ball rolls down her palm out through her fingers, which isn't something you would typically teach, but she does pretty well with it. The question is, if she didn't do it, would she have a bit more of a consistent serve? You can't prove that That's always the interesting part to all this stuff. If someone does something that isn't maybe perfectly textbook, but it's okay, and they've got a great result, if they did everything textbook, would they be even better? So release points, you can see sort of these arm angles to the side somewhat. Again, there's a lot of variability here, but there is a range of acceptability. So variability is fine. Ranges of acceptability is where we have to hold them to. So we don't want extremes and outside the ranges of acceptability. It's like this. This is an outside range of acceptability. So again, covering the face to protect the innocent, because we want to make sure that when you show sort of bad technique stuff, we don't highlight the player if they're not a professional. If they're a professional, I don't really mind. It's their job. They get critiqued all the time. But if they're a junior, we want to sort of protect who the junior is. So from that standpoint. But you see that makes it really tough to get a consistent toss. So you'll hear the J toss sometimes, which is off the front, inside of the front leg, out along the baseline, which is okay. It's about as far of that range as you would say is acceptable. It's just really, really hard to get a consistent toss that way. Because a lot of the time for a righty, the toss will get left. They'll come down here and the ball will end up over there. There are players that have been successful with it, but it's harder. So this is an extreme J toss. This is actually when they're back here. So back here, they have to throw it forward to make contact. And the odds of it being consistent is pretty low. So limit that option. That probably shouldn't be in the ranges of acceptability. Here's an example of the elephant toss, we'd call it. It's like an elephant trunk. You see this quite a bit with some of the juniors where the head comes down, the arm comes down, and they're here. This just makes life a lot harder to get the ball out. So it's a long distance for it to travel. So limit that situation as much as possible. When we talk landing, here's foot up, foot back. The purpose of this slide was to show shoulder position, elbow position, with the different foot ups versus foot backs situation. And Justine had foot up and foot back multiple times throughout her career. She was changing her service stance throughout her career. Didn't seem to make that much of a difference. I mean, she had a pretty good serve her entire career, and she was changing pretty consistently foot up versus foot back. A few other players that have done that as well. So that tells us as well something about which is better, which is not better. There's some personal preference there. There's some style aspect to it. Angles, positions, just really highlighting the nice symmetry when you get in some of these nice positions. So again, angles are important. We have to be careful with photos though, because I take one extra frame and his arm's going to be here, or his arm's going to be there if I took a frame earlier or a frame later. So just be careful with looking at still photos and saying, okay, well that's the position. That is the position for that 1/1000th of a second that we're taking that photo. But it changes a little bit as they move through it. So John McEnroe, he was 50 or 51 when this photo was taken. Pretty good mechanics. He hits all the points we pretty much talked about. Good hip turn, good twist rotation, good elbow position. For his age, really good symmetry. So a lot of people say, well, he had a really strange motion. And when you look at it here, he looks like everyone else. So he got to that position pretty well from that perspective. He had some interesting how he started, but his general loading mechanics was pretty consistent. So something to consider from that standpoint. So let me go through here. So we throw out 13 to 16-year-old examples here. Want to just kind of give that scenario. So these are good. So good players, a lot of the time we throw out bad and say this is good or this is bad. These are considered in the realm of good to very good. Leg loading, and these are all serves. These aren't staged or anything. These are just, you go to a club that has some good national ranked players. These aren't the best in the country, but they're good. They're all top 100 junior players in the US. So they're good players, typical players level-wise you would see at a lot of your clubs. And you see they're all getting into sort of the right positions. They all have some little bit style differences, little bit of variations, but in general, you'd be pretty happy with most of those in the load. So some people say, well, that's 13, 16, they have strength. How about a kid like this who's 10? Who's a 10-year-old? So, standard positions that we would expect to see. There's no reason they can't get in these positions. So, we want to make sure we don't undervalue what someone younger can do. They're not going to have the pace, they're not going to have certain things, but there are positions that they can get into. There's nothing strength-wise why they can't get into this position. So we have to make sure that we try to work with our younger athletes to work on getting them in a framework and mindset of developing sort of, you've got your adult model serve and then you've got your child model serve. The basic premise shouldn't be that different, but there are some definite differences. But you've got to have a mindset of, we can still work through some of these. We can just understand what their limitations are. One of the biggest challenges, as you guys all know, is the height of the ball when they're young. Their head's so big, body's so small. The moment they look up, they lose coordination. And that's the hardest part with serving. It's less of a strength issue. As long as an athlete can jump this high at 10, they can serve from a lower body perspective. The question is, can they coordinate their limbs? Can they link their upper and lower body together? Can they release the ball toss in the right spot? And can they make contact? That's where it gets a little more challenging, but it's not a strength issue. And that's something that I hear sometimes from coaches, which kind of annoys me a little bit because, don't tell the kid he can't do something when he can. I mean, there's plenty of players that can do things. They may not hit a great serve, but it's not because they don't have the strength. There are some strength limitations that limit your ability to do certain things right, and I'll show you some older ones that you can obviously see have some strength limitations that limit certain movements. Lack of knee bend, so this is actually during load. So hopefully you don't have too many players like this this was the J-toss person. They threw the ball up and there was very much no knee bend. So we want to make sure we don't have a lack of knee bend. Most players don't. I think most coaches are well aware of the benefit of using your legs, but there are the occasional player that's kind of sneaks through, so just be aware of that. These two are interesting. These are two players that you'll see a lot, and these type of players, not specifically these two players, but you'll see a lot, and coaches will miss this. They'll be like, well, they look fine. Their lower body looks fine. They've got knee bend, things like that. The problem is the female on the right is not using her back leg. Notice how there's no push. The toes on the ground, but nothing else is. There's not enough push there. Then the male on the screen has shifted his weight too far forward too early. Very, very early weight shift. Nothing's going to be able to come out of the back leg. So that's leaving a lot on the table. So there's a couple different things there that you want to be aware of when you're analyzing and looking. Some of those most common things or common errors that people sometimes miss because they've got components that look right, but there is no twist rotation either on the guy who's pushing his weight forward early. So what we're looking at here, this is some data from our lab. We do a bunch of force plate stuff with serves, looking at what's the relationship between front and back leg. And you don't need to worry too much about the numbers. It's more, this is the right leg, is the red number, and then the purple number is the left leg. So from that standpoint, we're showing, the right leg, back here, loads first, and then the left leg shifts in. So that's all we're showing. We're showing that we load the right first, and then it shifts quickly to the left, which does the work. So that's one aspect of it. The percentages, depending on the athlete, we tinker with. It's not a standard I want. Some people go, what's the percentage? The percentage of what is always what I ask. They say, well, the percentage of how much they put on their back leg versus their front leg. I say, at what part of the motion? Because it's on the back and it's on the front at different parts of the motion. On the back part of the motion, or the load part, we're usually somewhere between 60 and 70% on the back. But then once they release and they shift their weight to the front, it's nearly 100%. It's in the high 90s by the time they come off the ground because the weight is shifted in that direction. So it depends on when in the motion we're talking about. It's not as simple as we're on 60% on this and 40% on that. It's a gradual shift. Kind of like a forehand. If you had a forehand, we load most of your weights on your back. As you transition into contact, your weight's all shifted forward. So it's not the same during load and during release and contact. For this example here, there was kind of lack of enough time on the back leg. So that was the purpose of this one. And then we were showing here the example where they had better delayed loading on the back leg. So this one, you still had loading on the back leg, but the time was short, so they came out of it and they shifted their weight forward early. This one, you were staying on that back leg a little bit longer. So that was the purpose of those two slides. Here's an example of three different players, all good nationally ranked players. They all kind of have the same problem. So here's an example of lack of back hip stability, lack of back leg load. Notice how the angle of the hip and the knee is a bit of a mess on all three of them. So their hip is collapsing, so their back hip, this hip is collapsing, knee goes in, but there's no weight on it. So that tells us that their hip stability, their strength in their back hip is not good. And players like this can still squat a lot sometimes. They can get under a bar and squat 70 kilos, 50 kilos pretty easily, some of these people that look like this. The problem is you put them on a single leg squat and they collapse in. You know, they collapse in really bad. You got to make sure you understand the difference, and if you see that with your players, we got to work on it because this is a sign that they'll likely get some injuries. They'll either get a hip injury or a knee injury because they're lacking in stability there. And you see this across different sports as well. It's one of the biggest predictors of ACL tears, which we don't have too many of in tennis, fortunately. We hardly have any. But we do have a lot of knee pain problems, and we have a lot of hip problems. So we got to make sure that we work on, if we evaluate this and we see that in our players, get someone to put them through a full assessment to see how bad are their hip strength, where is their instability, and then get them on a prehab, rehab type program to make sure you fix that. And this should be fixed in a few weeks if they do it diligently. Not hard to fix, it's just you got to make sure they're doing the right exercises. So again, we talked on this already, pushing the front hip into the court. Again, a lot of people look at that and they don't think that's wrong. The problem is you've shifted all your weight forward and then you have to over-rotate. So if you do this, your only way to make contact now, you can't stay in this position really. You actually have to rotate early. And you see that a lot, where when people jumping, they try to get that knee bend and they try to jump into the court. A lot of the time, this is not always, but it's a result a lot of the time of coaches well-meaning putting like a brick or a board or something and telling their player to jump over it. So they'll get themselves in that position sometimes because they're forcing the jump. So they're having to get themselves to here over the box. They'll come around like this to get that movement sometimes. So you want to be a little careful with what implements you use and what tools you utilize, and making sure that you're not somehow creating a bad pattern when you're trying to actually improve the pattern. Because a lot of players want that so they jump forward. The question is, you can still jump forward with the wrong technique if you have to. The problem is the moment you take out the board, they're going to still have this position, but then now they're going to drop even deeper into the knee bend. And you see that quite a bit where they drop into the knee bend a lot and then they get nothing out of their legs. Because the deeper you go in the knee bend below a certain point, the more you dissipate your energy. So if anyone's done a vertical jump before, you'll think about it. The best vertical jumpers don't do this. They're not down here. They're in about that position there, and then they jump from there. So there's that range that we want that is optimal. Anything above or below it is less than optimal. So we've got to find that optimum range for your athletes. And most of the time, it's pretty similar. It's about there. Usually when players come in, and with good players, the first thing that you change is actually the depth of the knee bend. You actually make it less deep. Because most of the time they're going a little bit too deep in the knee bend, and you got to actually shorten the knee bend a little bit so they can come out of it quicker. So not in all cases, but a lot of the times they're players that don't have the velocity on the serve that we want them to have. If they've got a lot of other things working well for them, is they're just sitting at the bottom too long. Remember, for every 1/10 of a second that we wait down here, we're losing energy out of their legs. So we want to get down and come out of the down. So remember, the concept is down slow, up and out of it really quick. So, okay, this concept sometimes is tied together. So you've got two aspects here. You've got this concept of hyperangulation, which I'll talk about, and then the foot around. We talk foot up and foot back. The third piece of the puzzle is this foot around that some people do. And there's variations of it. You can have extreme foot around, which people foot fault all the time. You have a modified, which is sort of here. You have this, or sometimes you have there. Problem with all of them is it allows and it encourages quick opening up of the hips too early. You can hit a pretty good slice serve with this motion. You can't hit a kick serve really at all. It's impossible to hit a kick serve from here. Think about where the hips are. It's really, really hard to do. So you want to be avoiding that as best you can. There's been a few pros that have served like that and have had pretty good serves, but they've always had some type of weakness or they've had a bad back problem. Usually it's a back problem that'll get most of them, the really good ones, because they can get away with making contact, but you have to do that. And by rotating through the lower back, that's where the pain spot is. So it's one of those things. It's very fixable. I never really understood why players would do it, because you've got a foot that exists on the front that actually blocks the back foot. So you can just hit the back foot into the front foot. So if you've got younger players, try not to let them get into that position, because it just opens up potential problems going forward. So the hyperangulation issue, this is simply when the elbow is behind the line of the shoulder. So if I'm serving this way, this elbow position here is back there. So if you think about it from a bench pressing standpoint, when we bench press, we don't really want our overhead athletes to go all the way down to the chest. Because what happens, we put our shoulder in a compromised position, increasing the risk of impingement right there, anytime we put weight back in this position. So by serving like this, we increase our risk of impingement. Doesn't mean it'll always happen, you just have increased your risk. It's kind of like doing a lot of heavy bench pressing for tennis players. There are some players that have been able to do it and not have any major issues, but most players, if they do heavy bench pressing down to that point, they're increasing their risk of instability and problems at the shoulder. And there's no real benefit to doing it. They're trying to find range in an area that they haven't got to because of their body. So if I'm here, why are we trying to get there? Because we haven't got there from our hip. If our hip turns, we can go as far as we like. So most people talk about Sampras probably had one of the most rotations out of any server. His elbow was always in line with his shoulder though. Never went past there. His hip turned, and you could see his back if you were playing him. So you got to understand the difference from that standpoint. They're getting the range, they're getting it from the hip, whereas some of these other players that aren't getting it from the right spot are getting it from the shoulder. You can see examples from this scenario of what we don't want. This was the situations where you open yourself up to shoulder problems. Elbow is behind the line of the shoulder. So we want to fix the technique. And Maria, after her shoulder surgery, she adjusted her technique because of this. But again, it's one of those things you want to make sure that we don't have to get to that point to make the adjustment. Our players at the young ages shouldn't ever be in there. So just understand what we're looking at and that we can avoid it. Lower elbow, I think I talked about this before. Don't have too many issues ever with lower elbow if you take care of the hip. So if you take care of dropping the back hip and twist rotating, your elbow issues usually go away, because you can't really drop your elbow then. Your racket's going to be down here. So if your hip is down low, your elbow stays in the appropriate position. If you don't, what happens? If you just squat straight down, you definitely can drop your elbow. If you don't shift your weight back, if you shift your weight forward, you can drop as well. So usually you fix the elbow issue by taking care of the lower body. If for some reason you do everything right and they've still got a funky elbow issue, usually what we'll do is we'll do the salute drill where, if I can borrow the racket quickly. So this one works pretty well to keep the elbow up. They just follow the tip of the racket to the eyes the entire way. So when you're semi-abbreviating their motion, so doing a long motion, you lose track of what's going on back there sometimes. Even if you've got palm down, you'll still lose track of what's happening. If you shorten it up, you can ensure that the elbow stays in this position, and then they get into there. So again, doesn't necessarily work in 100% of the cases, but it's a real good simple cue. Have their eyes follow the tip of the racket as long as possible, and it'll keep their elbow in sort of that position. But again, focus as much as we can on taking care of the lower body as best as we can, because that controls a lot of what happens at the upper body. The high elbow issues, again, hip related most of the time. So some of you have players like this. This is a pretty extreme case, and this is a real serve. Think about what she needs to do next to come down. Drives into that position really fast. So again, shifting the weight forward, pretty unique serve from that standpoint. Not something we would typically recommend, but again, it's where does they end up and can they get into the next position. So a lot of things here to talk through. We talked on this already a little bit. You can see a lot of players foot around. We see this both men and women. This is not necessarily gender heavy. You see a little bit more probably on the women's side, but not like some of the other aspects of the serve, especially shifting the hip forward, which is one of the bigger ones that you do see a big difference in the men's and women's serving mechanics a lot of the time. Not 100% of the time, but you do see it quite a bit where the back leg doesn't drive. And then the moment you cue them, drive your back leg, push all your weight through your back heel and your back hip, they change immediately. It's a very easy fix. It's more of an awareness issue that they're not even realizing the weight shifted forward. So if we can get them to shift, drive into the back leg, and then make everything come out of the back leg. So back leg serving, if you haven't done that, serve a bunch of serves off the back leg where they literally put their toe on the ground, throw the ball up, lift the leg up, serve, land, like you would normally do. We've done some internal research on to see serve speed differences, and there's usually on the men's side about 5% difference, 5 to 7% difference in serve speed between a back leg serve only and a 2-foot serve. On the women's side, once they practice it, there's even less. It's usually about a 3% difference only in serve speed. So there's very little difference in 2-foot versus 1-serve speed off the back leg if it's done correctly. So that also tells you the importance of the back leg and how it incorporates or is valued in the service motion. So good cocking positions here. A couple things to think about. To get into optimum cocking position, we need thoracic spine. So here upwards is what we're talking about. You got to make sure that that top part of the spine has range. If you've ever seen a cattle whip, you have the bottom part is pretty stiff and firm. The top part moves really violently. That's kind of how the spine works somewhat. The bottom part is pretty stiff. It's not meant to move that much. The top part's meant to move quite a bit. So most tennis players are really tight through there, unfortunately. We do a lot of this and a lot of serving, but we don't do a lot of that movement, which is what we want. You may have heard the coaching cue, chest to the sky. Throw the ball up, chest to the sky. That's thoracic movement. We got to improve your thoracic range of motion. So really, really important that that is taken care of with your players to optimize and improve their ability to hit that that serve. Kick serve, flat serve, especially kick serve though. Because one of the things is we don't want the lower back doing the work. L4, L5, S1, spine, lumbar aspect predominantly. We don't want loading going into that, and we don't want flexion and extension, predominantly extension in the spine at that point. We're okay with it up there because the body's designed for it there. We just don't want it down here. And too many players have problems down there because of this position, lack of mobility through the upper part of the spine, so they try to get it from the lower part. One of the biggest injury concerns with youth tennis players, competitive players, is pars fractures and lumbar pain, so lower back pain. Relatively easy to fix if we take care of these issues. The challenge is it takes some time. Players need to do daily work on it. You got to make sure they're doing the right things. That's on the serve. There's other factors as to why they may get lower back problems with ground strokes. There's issues with loading, shifting, twisting, and not releasing through the hip. But on the serve, the issues are relatively easy to fix with some technical work, making sure their technique is right, but secondarily making sure that they have the range in the thoracic region especially. So make sure you start thinking about that a little bit more with your players. The palm up, this was back when Novak had his serve challenges, 5 years ago now, something like that. He fixed them. Took him 9 months probably, 6 to 9 months to really fix them up. But notice positioning here. Quite extreme. One, it's partly thoracic range, but two, he is going into his lumbar, and that's not good at this point. His palm is open, basically an extreme weighted position there. And that was when he had those challenges where he then sky hooked the serve to try to make it. And it's pretty interesting to see such a world-class player actually struggle that much with something that he'd done all his life and just lost the rhythm, lost the technique. So if it can happen at that level, it can definitely happen with any of your players. So don't feel too bad if you go through stages with your players where they may lose it a little bit, because it can happen. But then you got to figure out what's the cause. It probably took them longer than you would have thought to fix that for a player at his level and his ability. But he was able to fix it pretty darn well. So, let me go through. This is the issue where they've kind of already opened up and they've collapsed, meaning that they've still got the elbow in tight, but they're like this now. So they're collapsing and they're doing that motion. And that's where you start to see a lot of the players that have the kind of slice serve only. They come through like this, and that's their only option, is to come around the ball like that. So be aware of that. See if you have players that do that and try to make some of those adjustments. Same type of thing. This is opening up a little bit too early again. So what do you think? Both of these are reasonably good, slightly different contact points, but again, one of the things is we don't want them to be straight up. I think sometimes people look at serving a contact and think, hey, I want my person 100% fully extended at contact. We really don't want that because that means they're only vertical. We want a slight forward lean, slight bend, so that means their energy transfer is going forward. It's only a small amount, but you can see that we want that little bit of a forward momentum happening. So really, really important concept to think about and to understand what your players look like. If you don't have a clear picture of all your high performance players right now, you should be able to think in your head, okay, Johnny looks like this, Sarah looks like this, Jimmy looks like that. You should be able to have that photograph, that video in your head right now of your players from these angles. Okay, so this is what happens. That's a real server. It doesn't look like a good player, but this player's actually pretty good. So you've got to see that's a common issue. And you're going to get a player with a shoulder problem for sure here because of the positioning of what the shoulder needs to do to make contact with it. And then also you're going to have potentially some challenges with the lower back here. Because for them to actually finish the contact, so it's a lefty, they have to again do that. So what happens? That's all in the lower back. So again, you see these scenarios play out over and over and over again, and you just don't want them to happen to your players. You want to make sure you can put those steps in place before anything major bad happens, because it robs them of performance. There's certain serves they can't hit, but the bigger picture is also the injury issues. And then pace. I mean, why would you think that they'd be able to get optimum pace from that position? They can't. And also, of course, the angle. They're losing probably a foot in height from where their optimum height would be. So their angles to hit the wide serves are really limited. So again, these are all standard contact point slight issues. Some are worse than others, but they're all limited. They're all players that you should be able to fix and improve their motions on. They've all opened up a little bit too early. They've all got slightly wrong arm angles. Their contact points are all slightly off. So again, some of them you may look at and be like, well, that doesn't look too bad. And it's true, it doesn't look too bad, but we've got scenarios, all of them there, that we want to fix. So depending on the level of player that you're working with, you may or may not fix some of those. But the higher ups you go, you want to make sure that none of your players have even those minor limitations from that standpoint. Okay, so this is a scenario there where you've got a collapsing issue and they're going to land on or behind the baseline. So that's someone that's typically over-rotated. It's called butt back, where the butt actually lands on or behind the baseline at contact. So for them to make contact in these type situations in the way they want, meaning they've been told, hey, make sure we make contact out in front, the only way to do that is to catch the ball a bit lower with our butt going backwards. So that's an adjustment that's being made by the athlete based on cues that the coach is probably telling them, well-meaning cues, hey, I want you to make contact out in front. But the only way to do that, if you've opened up early, is to slide back. So again, this is probably one of the more common things that we see. Okay, so at this point, any questions? I've gone through a lot of different scenarios here, so I just want to open it up a little bit. See any questions related to any of these or any things that you've seen with your players that we haven't covered?
First of, what is optimum height and how high is too high, how high is too low, and how to train the timing of going into the point of contact so you got all the segments working in the right place.
So first question was how high, optimum height of ball, varies a lot based on knee bend, based on are you a full swing versus an abbreviated swing. Abbreviated swings have lower ball tosses. So and when you say height, are you talking about height of contact? Height of the ball toss? Yeah, so height of the ball toss doesn't really concern me too much. We just want it to be on the way down when we make contact. And we just don't want extreme height. Because if the height of the ball toss is usually determined by how much knee bend and how deep your knee bend is going to be and how long your swing is going to be. So take care of the swing piece a little bit first and usually err on the side of lower than higher. Most people have way too high a ball toss. So shortening the ball toss is very rarely a bad idea. There's the occasional too low a ball toss scenario, but more often than not, more issues are caused by higher ball tosses than lower ball tosses. So that's that aspect. The second question?
I'm working with 13 years old and she's struggling to make a good extension into so her body fully extended. And the question is how you can, if there's any suggestion how you practice that timing, that every segment is working in the right time to get the full extension.
Yeah, so timing's a term, we all kind of use it. If you actually describe what timing is, it's hard to describe it. It just is basically when we store our energy correct, do we release it in the right sequence and the right, summation of forces. So it's really about getting it stored right. And as much as we want good timing, teaching timing is all about storing and releasing energy. So talk to them more so about load that back hip, twist, rotate, and then push your shoulder. Usually what I use as a cue is push your back shoulder towards the net post the right net post, because it keeps you side on longer. And by doing that, it stops them thinking about anything else. And they're going to make contact with the ball, because that's what competitors do. So by getting their body started in the right direction, you should help with the timing piece of it. You know, and it's again, a lot of that piece is the cues you use with your players. Some players will respond really well to that. Other players, you know, there's coaches that use terms like make yourself feel like a noodle, you know, which basically means just relax. You know, it's another term to say that, and try to get things flowing. And other people use a metronome. Okay, so take a bounce, 1, 2, 3, and then the last piece needs to actually be quicker. All good servers explode up. They don't have that fourth piece that's super slow. So if you're doing a 4-second count on a metronome or something like that, make sure the fourth piece, the explosive piece, is faster. It's not 1, 2, 3, 4. It's 1, 2, 3, 4. And the 4 piece is really quick. So if you want to work timing like that, I don't know how many of you use metronomes or some other timing type cue to help your athletes get the rhythm and know when they load, when they explode. But that's a way that can work pretty well.
Hi, Mark.
Yeah.
You mentioned how having a step, like a Reebok step, and trying to increase leg drive is not a great idea to get them to jump over it. Guilty here, trying that a few times. Do you have any like practical ways in which you might increase that load, especially using the back leg, that you could show us here? A couple of ways.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, maybe let me re-clarify how I phrase that. I don't say it's never a good idea. It has some good uses to teach the concept. It's just what we see a lot when they do that is that they overload the jump piece, forgetting about why they're trying to jump. The jump is to try to really get off the ground with the back leg and explode up. And if they put a step in front of them, a lot of the time is they'll shift their mechanics on the front leg too much, and then they'll jump off the front leg. So we're sort of re-teaching a bad trajectory because they have to maybe get over that distance. So I'll do something similar. I just won't make it as high usually. So it'll be a small cone or it'll be a marker or something like that. But reminding them and cueing them, use your back leg. So yeah, so we can do a couple of those. Is someone here that wants to hit a few serves? Oh, we got someone warming up. Perfect timing. So hit a couple and we'll take a look. So we saw a lot of stuff. Try to observe if you notice anything that we saw on any of the slides. Good. So overall, yeah, really nice motion. So not a lot there. Couple things I observed that we could probably get his consistency a little bit better. One time he brings his foot around a little bit. One time you sort of bring it in. So you want to try to get that a little bit more consistent. So think about when you serve, instead of doing this, try to just bring it in here. Because that'll allow a little bit more consistency with the motion. Does that feel okay? Yeah, not too bad. Good. So again, he's got a good motion. We're not going to, mess up a good motion, but we want to find a couple little things that can maybe get him a little more consistent with it. And then if we want a little bit more pop, because he hits it pretty hard, but we could always add a little bit more. When you bring that foot up, think drive this half of the foot into the ground on the back leg. So what's happened here? He's missed 2 in the net. He's trying to drop lower because, hold up one sec. because I gave him an instruction to push into the ground a little bit more on the back leg, and we see this a lot. The first thing they think is, I got to drop lower then. It's not what we want. We want them to bring up, drive quicker off the back leg, but push harder. So that was bad on my part. My explanation translated badly. So when you push that back leg down, try to drive up quicker. There you go. Good. Good. Okay, so maybe tell people, was there a difference in how I communicated the first time versus the second time?
The second time it's more explanation to get up off the ground
Yep.
rather than just sinking off.
Exactly, because you got stuck.
Stuff.
Exactly.
You can get up to the ball.
Yeah. And we see that a lot, and that's, again, the art of what we do. We've got to be careful with the terminology that we're using, because I knew what I was trying to get him to do. He interpreted as sink in lower and longer, which dissipates your energy. So, yeah, great motion, really nice. What we may want to do to get more out of his back leg is, have you ever served off back leg before? Okay, so start like this so you get balance, then throw it up and actually serve like you would normally do, but only off your back leg. There you go. Good. Try to use your leg though. You're using your arm to do most of the work. Yep. So we see we have an opportunity here. You're probably leaving 3 to 4 miles on the table right now in your normal serve. How'd that feel?
A little bit strange.
Yeah. It's always going to feel strange the first few times you do this one. Yep. Try to lift that leg up. And again, you don't want to do too many of these the first day with someone, because they typically say the next day, if they do like 30 or 40 of these, they start saying, hey, my lower back, not so much here, but the side, you've got your obliques have to do work that they've never really done before. So you want to be careful how many reps you do the first couple times you do with that, because you're using muscles that most players don't use that well. Nice. Hit a couple regular ones now. Good. Okay, nice. So, good motion. So, or with someone like that, you want to get out of the way and just see, can we start hitting our spots better? Can we add 1, 2, 3 kilometers an hour to the motion? Can we start adding some variation there? How about your kick serve? How's your kick serve? Good. So, again, pretty good motion. There's an opportunity here to get a little bit more movement this way. So, what do you try to do on your kick serve? What's sort of the thing that's going through your head? Side of the ball? Okay, so keep doing that. Just think about driving back leg down towards me. Everything else the same, but see where I'm standing? You're going to push your back hip towards me during your load, but don't sink into the ground. Good, that's right. See that one? That's the air we need on this. And swing a little faster. Good. Now get up more, swing faster. Good. So one of the things on the kick serve, most of the players, they don't swing fast enough because they're used to an old motion or what they've maybe used to do. If they have the right technique, the faster they swing, the more spin they're going to get, the more bounce and height over the net they're going to get. And it's never going to go long because the faster you swing, the more spin, it'll drop into the court more. but it feels weird for most players. Most players think, well, I'm swinging too fast. But they are still, a lot of the time, thinking of an older motion where they weren't able to load and drive as explosively as you would like them to. Do 2 more of those. Good. But swing faster, hey? That was a 70% serve. How you feel? Not too bad? Yeah. So really try to get heavy kick on this. You've got 2 seconds right now. So again, you see this with a lot of players where they have sort of 2 seconds. They have that flatter, harder line drive more second, which has some spin, but it comes through quick. And then they have that slower one where it has more air with more spin on it, which is okay. You've just got to realize, you know you've got sort of those 2 types of serves. What do you usually use in matches? Yeah, the first one. So the first one works if you hit your spots really well and it's really wide. It doesn't work so well if you're right in the slot, because then the player's on top of it, it's not getting out of their strike zone. They can return that one pretty well. So the other one is the one that can jump a bit more and can give you a little bit more option. So try the other one a little bit more. That's the serve, but you're hitting it slow. Yeah, go after it. You got it. Go after it. That's better. That was good. That was the first version. That was a little low, little line drive. Okay, that was that first line drive version. We wanted a bit more spin. So this is the type of scenario with a server that serves as well as he serves. We're looking at what options can we give him to add to his game. Because he's got the flat serve, he's got the first serve pretty well. You know, now it's about, can he hit his spots, and does he have enough variety that when he comes up against someone that returns well, and he's hitting all of these that are just like right here in the guy's zone, he's going to get, you know, beat. Even though he's making good number of serves, they may not have as much variation. So you've got to add a component to it. And right now it's adding that extra spin. He can do it, there's no doubt. It's just we've got to get it more consistent. Good, good. Okay, last one. Good. So what was your name? George. Nice to meet you. Hey, you've got a bunch of coaches here. Does anyone need a new, do you have a coach right now? No, he's looking for a coach. You know, you're playing, yeah? You're playing at the moment? So yeah, he's looking to play full time. So he's got some ability there. That was really good serving. Really, really, really nice serving. Any other thoughts on anything we talked about now, or even in the morning, if there's anything that we hadn't covered?
2 things, Mark. First one is you talked about the time at the ball release between 1:30 and 3 o'clock. What time would you say should be at contact? Yeah,
so it varies a little bit, but contact is going to be somewhere in this range of 12:30 usually, to 1 o'clock, 12, depending on the serve. We're talking kick, willing to give it a little bit, 12 o'clock-ish, maybe 11:30 if they've got really good thoracic rotation. But again, it comes down a lot to do with what type of serve are we hitting and what level are you at. If you're at a junior level, you got a little bit more variation. If you're at the highest level of the pros, you give away that much distance on the serve, you're giving away quite a lot to your opponent. So we have to be a little careful with how much we want to give away. But yes, it's in that general range.
And the second thing was, obviously, a lot of players will move their left foot as they go through their serve, obviously with the momentum. Do you ever work with players on actually starting in the position that they move to? So if they start here and then they move the foot, would you ever just recommend starting there?
No, that aspect, a lot of the time, they do it to allow for hip turn. So Brian's do it, Sam Stozer does it, where they start here and they shift their foot, which allows good hip turn. So that's fine. I'm surprised more people don't do it. You know, it's one of those things. I mean, you got to be a little careful with foot faulting that you don't step on the line. But in general, what it allows you to do is get into that hip turn pretty easily. So that's one. The other one, I think you were demonstrating. More talking about someone that does this to here or here to there.
Yeah, it starts here and then bringing it away.
Yeah, bringing it this way.
No, bringing it the other way.
The other way, yeah.
Start on the line and then bring it away.
Yeah, so here to there. Yeah, so it's the same concept. It's trying to get that extra hip turn. So starting here, it doesn't limit your hip turn, but it just doesn't give you that extra little bit of momentum as that's shifting. So I wouldn't change it if they do it. But again, that's a bit of a style thing. Do they get into the load right? If they do, keep doing what they're doing. If they don't, let's make an adjustment there.
Two questions again. Firstly, the wrist staying down on the way back, if it's important. And secondly, I think something I've come across a lot, is there a common thing on the slice serve? Because you sometimes get, you know, I think that all players, sometimes you get it, but you don't get that consistent nice one. Is there a common theme for that? Where someone, I mean, like, I think Andy, he's got that unbelievable slice now.
Yeah, no, and the first one, the palm down is good. It's a great coaching tip. The concept, the reason we want palm down is to get to there. If we get to there, it doesn't matter. You know, think about, you know, Raonic, for example. You know, he goes palm open to there. So it's not a bad coaching cue. I use it a lot, but do they get to here? If they get to here, it doesn't really matter. It's just, that's the easier option. So yeah, I use that a lot, but it's about what are we trying to get the athlete to do? Where are we trying to get them to? And is that the cue that works best for them? Usually it does. It works really well palm down from that standpoint. But it's because it's how we teach people to throw. That's where it came from. For in baseball, that's how you throw. You come in this position and then you release. So yeah, very good. And then for the slice side of things, yeah, a lot of it has to do with where are we in space and how quick can we accelerate from here to here. Because, you know, the angle of the racket's not that much different between a flat and a slice serve. But why do some people hit a great slice serve and others don't? You know, Andy, for example, he does bring his foot around a little bit, which gives him a little bit more on the slice serve, makes it a little bit harder for a really effective kick, though, because of that. And you know, so you know, it's one of those things where when everyone played on grass, that wasn't that uncommon to have your foot come around because you were following it to the net as well. But now, when you don't want to limit yourself with some of those body positions as well. But you can, you know, for example, you know, getting from here into that position, we got to stay shoulder over shoulder and then explode through with the tip of the racket as best we can. That coaching cue of tip of the racket to the ball usually can provide some value from a standpoint of understanding the trajectory. It's not actually what happens because the racket comes through, but thinking tip of the racket allows them to stay side on just a bit longer through, and then also allowing them to come, you know, through a little bit faster. I think one of the problems that, and you probably see it a lot, is they just don't swing as fast on the slice serve. So by not swinging as fast, they don't get as much spin. And if we can get them to swing quicker, it puts that more spin on it. But then they have to adjust their target zone because then, you know, they think it's always going to go out. But it's more, you know, can we get them to get that consistent positioning of the racket through target zone? And if you're working with someone and looking at that, take the video at contact at the slowest speeds you can see it, or take really fast speed photos and see what's actually happening just before and just during contact, because that's where all the slice really comes from. Because if our body position's correct, because it's just what's the angle of the racket and how quickly is it moving through space.
Were there any more questions for Mark? No? Okay, well, first of all, I think a huge round of applause to Mark for that session.
Thank you.
From my point of view, a a huge amount of knowledge and a huge amount of content that you brought to life through practical things that will resonate with us as coaches. Yes, my player does that. Yes, they throw it too high. Yes, that's the reason why they do it. So it's always nice to humanize some of the issues that we face in day in, day out that frustrate us as coaches. So thank you for that. And you really built upon the knowledge as you went through the presentation. So thank you very much. All it leaves me to say is a huge thanks to everyone that's turned up today. Again, it's a day out of your diary. It's a day away from your program. It's a day away from your players. It's loss of money. But the way we want to try and give back to you is by offering these opportunities where we invite world-class speakers like Mark from around the world and provide their insight. And as you can see, it didn't just take him a day to write that content. That's years and years of work packaged into a day's worth of content. And I think we're really lucky to actually be able to listen to Mark deliver that message. Thank you very much, everyone. Safe journey home, and we'll see you at another LTA Performance Coach Support Program opportunity in the future. Thank you.